Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Ask an Addiction Specialist. I'm Bob Weathers. Very happy to be with you this week. You're used to seeing me with my counterpart, Odie Martinez, usually sitting next to me. Odie's handling half of the technical responsibilities today, and the other half are being handled by the other co-producer here in the studio, Austin Armstrong. So many thanks to both Odie and Austin for being with us. Why they're busy today is that we have a guest, a returning guest, and I'm going to introduce her in just a moment. But before I do that, let me catch you up a little bit on this podcast. If it's the first one you've come to, my background's in psychology, as is our guest today. And for the last number of years, I've been working more and more exclusively to where that's all I do now is I work in recovery coaching. So all of my work is in addiction recovery. And it's very meaningful and fulfilling to me. We, over the last year to close to a year and a half here at Ask an Addiction Specialist, we've been posting weekly podcasts. They're video podcasts that are available in multiple forms, including you can go to YouTube, look under Ask an Addiction Specialist. If you've entered into the Facebook group, that's at Ask an Addiction Specialist. You're also welcome to go to the website of Beginnings Treatment Centers, who are also a co-sponsor of our weekly podcast at Beginnings Treatment Centers, which are centered here in Costa Mesa in Orange County in Southern California. There's a whole archive of podcasts available there, too. In fact, while I'm thinking of it, we last met 2 weeks ago, and our topic was on forgiveness. The title of that presentation was Forgive and Remember. A little bit of reworking of the traditional adage, forgive and forget. And I recommend you to that podcast. It included a practical application of a forgiveness meditation that might be useful to you, whether you're in recovery yourself or a family member or loved one of somebody in recovery. I think that forgiveness is a universal asset, and we talked about it that way, so I recommend you to that. Which brings me to our podcast today. Our special returning guest is Dr. Cheryl Bildner, a very dear friend of mine, a clinical psychologist who hails from New Hampshire. She was with us back in mid-January, and I want to recommend that you take a look at that podcast, because today is that podcast kind of part two. This is addressing the opioid epidemic. And Dr. Bildner is returning to, we're going to improvise today, talk into the work that Cheryl's doing, that's innovative work on the East Coast, and hopefully link it to work I'm doing here on the West Coast. And our goal is to facilitate providing information that may be useful to you as the observer. For any of you who are in recovery or considering recovery, I hope it to be useful to you. If you're the loved one of someone in recovery, I hope that you find resources here. If you're a mental health professional or recovery worker working actively in addiction treatment, I hope that this will serve you as well. You couldn't be in better hands, because Cheryl, a dear friend, is as bright as they come and as deeply informed. She smiles, she laughs, but it's true. Okay. One final thing before we dive in, and that is that Cheryl and I are going to be dialoguing today. She's in New Hampshire. She's in her kitchen. Is that right? Okay, Cheryl.
That's right.
Last time we met, I think we're evolving, Cheryl. Last time we met, she was speaking from the library in
the basement of the library.
The basement of the library in North Conway, Hampshire, and New Hampshire, and I can picture that library and that basement. And I guess we've got enough bandwidth to be able to work from your kitchen, which is great. As Bob and Cheryl are talking today, it's going to be hard for me not to call you Dr. C. We've referred to each other as Dr.
That's
C
fine.
and
That's
Dr.
fine.
Okay, all right. We've had a dear friendship for the better part of the last 15 to 20 years now, and worked together for 3 years in my infamous New Hampshire stint back in the 2000s. And what I want to invite you to do is to interact with Cheryl and myself And Austin and Odie will moderate any questions that you send in. You can send those in through the Facebook group at Ask an Addiction Specialist in the chat function. Send those questions or comments to us, and Cheryl and I'll do our best to respond to those in real time. So I want to invite you to please feel free to submit questions or observations as we're talking, okay? So with that, I'd like to hand the baton to you, Cheryl, and any further comments of introduction you want to make, and let's see where we go, okay?
Absolutely, absolutely. So I'm a clinical psychologist in New Hampshire. I'm located in a mountain town about 3 hours north of Boston. And it's a pretty rural community, although there's definitely a tourist component to it with the mountains and the skiing and the summer activities. There's also the obstacles that exist in many rural settings. Access to healthcare, lack of services, lack of mental health services, certainly lack of services for individuals in need for addiction, and transportation issues, childcare issues, the obstacles that exist all over this country. It's not unique to this town. Unfortunately, this area has been hit very hard by the opiate epidemic, and I've spent the past 5 years working to help individuals in recovery, all stages of recovery. And from Dr. Bob, the way that you describe things out there, there are so few services, and there are waiting lists to get into treatment, and there's no, inpatient facilities within an hour of here. And, if you have a car, it's hard to get there. So one of the things I've been an advocate for is telemedicine and providing medication-assisted treatment, which is a big movement here through telemedicine.
Yeah. I'd like to talk into several elements that you've raised, Cheryl, with your permission, just kind of see where we go. Let me organize my thoughts here for just a second. I'll tell you what I was thinking of as you were presenting. I know that you went to school in Philadelphia, and Cheryl, right before I came in here, it's on my phone right now. I got a copy of the announcement that's going out. I'll be flying to Philadelphia at the end of April to present to 3 different schools of pharmacy, including a Temple University and 2 others that have a consortium, and they're going to have a meeting for the public as well as for students in pharmacy as well as other professionals. The title of it is From RX, as in prescriptions, to heroin. So it's going to be looking at the migration from those that start off with prescription medications, sometimes prescribed through a physician, sometimes gained illicitly, and how that gravitates towards heroin use and addiction. And I'd like to talk into that with you because I would imagine that this pertains to your neck of the woods. The piece of it that came to my mind as I was listening to you right now, Cheryl, is that I didn't realize this, and it's actually on the announcement announcing this event that I'll be speaking at. They say that in 2017, Philadelphia had the highest overdose death rate of the top 10 largest U.S. cities. You might well be aware of that. But as you're talking about working in rural United States, in your case in upstate New Hampshire, whether we're talking about downtown Philadelphia or rural New Hampshire, that this is a problem across the country in all domains. There's some specific problems that arise in your neck of the woods, being in the Mount Washington Valley, that I would imagine are different than some of the same specific problems in Philadelphia, though I don't know for sure, just in terms of accessibility to services. It's no accident that I have 3 different universities coming together to invite me to come speak there. That suggests resource. There's collective energies coming together that I would imagine are harder to rally where you live. I wonder if you could speak into some of the complications of providing services when there's not a lot of resource there locally. And also if you could speak into, and I want to invite whatever you're willing to talk about. Cheryl, I'm very aware that the last time that you came in January that you were talking about a project that was on the cusp of formulating in terms of providing telemedical outreach to the Mount Washington Valley. And I want to leave it to you in terms of how you want to update us on that. But it does pertain to this issue of accessibility of services. So kind of all of that, accessibility of services in an outlying area that isn't downtown metropolitan Philadelphia. How do you deal with that? What are some of the barriers that you're running into in the last few weeks since we last spoke?
I mean, one of the big things that certainly an obstacle is care coordination. So I'm a psychologist. I don't work directly in conjunction with a medication-assisted treatment program, but I certainly try to coordinate care with providers. That's hard. We're all working during the day. So unless we do, care coordination between clients or at the end of the day or at the beginning of the day, it doesn't happen. So optimal care, there could be a lot of splitting and, miscommunications and telling one provider one thing. And so some of the providers make treatment counseling mandatory, some do not. And we try our best to coordinate care, but again, obstacles exist. Most of the individuals up in this area are Medicaid recipients.
Right.
There are different Medicaid programs that have different benefits. So it's very important to know for the provider, if you want reimbursement, which unfortunately we all need, or most of us need, we have to make sure that the benefits are covered. Many times healthcare gets turned off if an individual doesn't maintain. When you're struggling with addiction, you have the paperwork to do, that's an obstacle. New Hampshire just implemented 100-hour a month. It's 80 or 100, 20-hour a week, 80-hour a month work requirement. They define work broadly, but some of the individuals I'm working with, the thought of not only trying to volunteer or work 20 hours a week, but recording that and turning that in are more obstacles. And if they lose their insurance, they'll lose their medication-assisted treatment program, then their therapy, and it all just, adds up.
Let me respond to both of these. The latter one, maybe let's start with the latter one, and just for a point of clarification, just for me to understand. So if I'm a client or a patient or different states have different language for this, but if I'm in that category, in order to qualify for services, I need to volunteer a minimum of a certain amount of hours per week, or work or volunteer. Did I understand that?
This is just going into effect as we speak. This is a new law, and it's there's a lot of opposition to it, obviously. But they're trying to have individuals, give back more, contribute more. But some of the burdens on, individuals struggling with addiction and childcare and, raising children and working, it's just adding more to the mound, more stress.
I've read about this more generally.
So
I have a general idea of it, but I haven't gotten as far as applying it to the population that you and I both work with, which are people that are in recovery from addiction. And what comes to my mind, and I'd love to have you talk into this because I know you've reflected on this more than I have. What comes to my mind is just the limitations in terms of mental resources, and I'm using that kind of in its broadest sense in terms of motivation, clarity of thought, ability to communicate, dealing with relapse prevention. There's so many things that go on, especially in early recovery, including in medication-assisted treatment, that the idea of my volunteering, much less working, it just seems like that's so fraught with problems, at least at first blush. Do you want to comment on that, Cheryl? What does that look like if I'm a client in early recovery, and now in order to qualify for services, I need to be working, and kind of like, it reminds me of the old dilemma of, in order to get a job, I need to have a resume that has jobs on it, but I don't have a resume that has jobs on it because you won't hire me for a job. There's a circularity to it, it seems like to me, but I'd love to hear your comments.
So this is still rolling out. So we're still learning about it week by week. Certain if you have a young child, I want to say under 2 or 3, you're exempt from the work requirement. If you're in treatment, if you're like in a treatment, that counts as a work hour.
Okay.
So like going to a therapist counts as a work hour.
Okay.
It's really interesting because there are so I'm thinking, I think about half of the MAT programs here don't have a behavioral health or counseling component to it.
That's interesting. That's interesting.
A lot of the primary medicine up here is just beginning to incorporate mental health components into treatment. We have we have one psychiatrist for the county, which has, gosh, how big is Carroll County?
Big.
It's big. Big. One psychiatrist. You have to go to a certain community mental health agency to access that.
Yeah.
The primary care doctors are really picking up the psychiatric medication component, which is, it's not their specialty, and they're certainly doing their best, but psychiatrists go to school for many years to learn the intricacies of prescribing.
Right.
So, and we talked last time about the lack of recovery coaches who are far enough along in their treatment. We lack a recovery coach base here because the problem is so prevalent that we just don't have the stability among the providers yet. Many of the providers, obviously, that's a generalization, but many of the providers, aren't far enough along in recovery to provide care.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
You know what comes to mind?
Medicine would be.
Say it again, Cheryl.
This is where the telemedicine component would be wonderful.
Yeah, Let's move to the telemedicine in just a moment, but let me respond to just this piece right here. And there's a question that's come in, and I'm going to try to weave it into an answer to the question. But in the interim, my family lived in Southern Oregon for a couple of years. It just happened to be at the time that I started elementary school, and we lived in a rural county in Southern Oregon, south of Klamath Falls. And I remember my dad being the only, my dad was a physician. My dad was the only doctor in that county and actually the neighboring county. But even more extreme was since there wasn't a veterinarian, my dad was by default the only veterinarian in these two counties. Is that bizarre or what? So I literally, Cheryl, have memories of growing up. I'm 5, 6 years old, have these traumatic memories, have these memories of people, farmers bringing their animals over into our living room and Dad doing work on it. I can literally remember him putting a cast on a dog, right in front of the television. We're trying to watch, Walt Disney, and it's a dog being...
Those were the days when you watched television.
Yeah. So the thought comes to mind, and I say it is literally true, and I was also say it somewhat with tongue in cheek. But you think about that, it's pretty pathetic. My dad wasn't trained as a veterinarian, and he was really by default that's what he did. Is that what happens, and you're really describing it, what happens, it's ironic and maybe not surprising. I run into my own version of that here in Southern California, which is much more populated, is that across the country, you may know the number on this, they're referred to as addictionologists. So psychiatrists that specialize in addiction medicine, it's a relatively select group across the country. At one point I knew I work locally with a couple of addiction specialists. These are psychiatrists who beyond their psychiatric residency now specialize in getting certified or whatever in addiction medicine. It's a relatively small group, but even if we expand it to psychiatrists, you've got one in all of Carroll County. There's no way that individual can handle all of the need. And so you have this going on, whether it's in the realm of medicine and a prescription of medications, or I think in yours and my domains, both of us have a background in clinical psychology. I work exclusively as an addiction specialist or a recovery coach right now, is that I see a tremendous number of people that work in the recovery world that are doing quasi-therapeutic interventions with no background in psychology. And I know I'm stating the obvious for
Yes.
you, and I want to be really respectful here. I think there's a tremendous value in people in recovery being able to turn it around and provide
Absolutely.
an understanding from the inside out. I happen to be in that latter category, which is sad but true, is that both with a background in clinical psychology, but as well as being in recovery from addiction, which you well know. But I'm just aware that my wife Colleen and I have talked about this. She's a licensed marriage and family therapist. Most therapists are working with clients, a fair number of clients, oftentimes a fair percentage of clients, that are dealing with clinically diagnosable addictive disorders with very little background, oftentimes the equivalent of like
Correct.
one course in addiction in graduate school, which is not nearly sufficient. And then you have recovery workers who are doing work that you've trained for years, or I've trained for years, in terms of psychological assessment, much less interventions, that are doing that with virtually no training to compare with what you've had. I'll pick on you for this, and it's just it's indicative. There's no single person to blame. It's indicative of kind of a systemic overload, it seems like to me. But I feel it every day, and I'll just say this. A couple of hours ago, as I was leaving a group, the director of the treatment center where I was leaving, we were discussing this issue. Is then what you have is that you have, I'll pick the example you used. You have medical staff that are doing medication-assisted treatment with very little understanding, or wouldn't even think to refer somebody for behavioral or mental health treatment. And at times, unwittingly, are even kind of undermining the foundations of psychological work, and vice versa. So you have these silos of these various disciplines of, I'll say, psychology for one, and psychotherapists, trained psychotherapists. You certainly physicians in the medical establishment, and then you have the entire world of recovery work, 12-step support groups, and so on. And the sad reality, at least in my experience, is there's not nearly enough. You talked earlier about coordination of services. There's not even an awareness of scope of practice.
Right.
It's like, I'll start doing medical interventions like my dad was doing veterinary interventions, and kind of necessity, but it's highly problematic, especially when you're talking, now we're no longer talking about the neighbor's dog with a broken leg. We're talking about somebody that if they overdose one more time, they're going to die. So it's really a problem. So that's a lot to say. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and in some states, the recovery coaches are not legally or permitted by the state licensing board to touch on mental health issues, and that's crazy. How could you be receiving treatment for addiction and not touch on mental health issues? Another concrete example that came to mind, and I don't know if this is something that you've experienced. I've conducted many groups facilitating groups for individuals very new to recovery.
Yes.
And really hard for newly recovering individuals to tell the difference between withdrawal symptoms and anxiety. So for instance, I'd be facilitating a group and someone would need to step out because their Suboxone's wearing off.
Right.
Meanwhile, we're talking about something very sensitive and very, anxiety provoking. And you see, many individuals were not able to sit with their anxiety. So that was one of the interventions that we were doing in the group, is learning, just because you're experiencing some feeling doesn't mean you have to jump and, take a strip off of your Suboxone. It's just learning to sit with that anxiety.
Yeah, it's a great example, Cheryl. Here's another example that comes to mind as I listen to you share that, is that, you think about a treatment center setting where you have people in various, on a continuum from, inpatient residential to sober living house arrangements, et cetera. You'll have somebody who's in early recovery, so by definition, experiencing post-acute withdrawal syndrome and the various symptoms of that, including emotional lability and impulse control issues and so on. And you'll have, how do I put this? I'll use your example. You'll have somebody with anxiety because they're dealing in therapy. Let's say they're seeing you in therapy dealing with trauma-related issues, and they come back on the unit and they're a little bit distraught or need some time alone, And because the right hand isn't speaking to the left hand, that person's wanting to spend some time alone to process what they just dealt with in therapy with Dr. Cheryl as seen as non-compliance, and then they're penalized or have privileges taken away. It's understandable looking at the surface level behavior, but that's the problem, is that there's not an awareness of what's going on and there's not a conversation going on. There's no context for that other than you're going to receive whatever the discipline is for not having been compliant with our rules of the house. Does that come up in your experience?
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It makes me think about, I don't know if you have a drug court in New Hampshire, in California. We have, which sounds like a wonderful alternative to incarceration, because rather than spending time in jail or in prison, you're going through, you know, a really, really rigorous. But interesting, it's very punitive. So if you relapse, or you know, if you mess up, if you're late to a group or don't make enough groups a week, they actually pour more responsibility on you. And it's like, gosh, it makes it harder and harder to jump through the hoops, you know, to get the help. So being in New Hampshire, I just have to, and I don't want to get too political, we have already have the presidential candidates coming through, and I just heard one of the presidential candidates, and he was talking about how we have, our jails are filled with individuals who have been caught in possession or dealing so many, you know, controlled substances, and meanwhile, the big pharma have gotten away with, you know, giving out, you know, the opioids for years and years, and there's no repercussions. And it's like, and we have the smaller person on the street, you know, who is getting penalized for something that big pharma should have been penalized for. And it's just, there's, and then the other thing that came to my mind when we were speaking is, you know, so much varies from state to state with the licensing laws. So one of the obstacles we've dealt with in New Hampshire is our telemedicine laws are lagging behind some of the other states. So last month, or 2 months ago, I was working for Boulder Care, which is a wonderful company providing telemedicine and MAT programs. But unfortunately, they had to redirect their energies outside of the state because of the telemedicine laws. Right now in our state legislature, we have a couple bills on the floor debating, you know, telemedicine in New Hampshire. Even if they were to pass, until reimbursements and the laws get trickled down to the insurance companies, until we could actually do it, we're talking a year or two out. It's there is an effort right now, PsychPack, that's trying to coordinate psychological treatment between states. You have to, you can all, as a psychologist providing telemedicine, at this point, you can only provide, the individual has to be in their state when initiate the call. You have to know the laws of your state. You have to know the laws of the receiving state. There's so many loopholes. You have to know if the insurance company will reimburse you for the practice. And you have to know all the resources that, you know, God forbid there's a crisis that comes up, that you're able to effectively address that crisis. So we're way away from that. And unfortunately, it seems like such a no-brainer, telemedicine, you know, give easy accessibility of care. You're not even addiction, you're not even medication assisted treatment, across all domains. But there are so many obstacles on the state level right now that's preventing, you know, this coordination. I feel like there's so many of these pockets within this industry, just in terms of the coordination of care on micro levels, on macro levels. You know, and then the other obstacle also in rural areas is it's very, and I say expensive in the most broad definition, for practitioners to get together. You know, I go down to Concord, which is the state capital, once or twice a month to participate in various, you know, lobbying efforts or groups, or, you know, the New Hampshire Psychological Association. That's a full day of work, you know, that you need to take off, you know, and it's, you know, 150 miles, and you know, it's a full day. So most practitioners don't have time and energy And certainly the medication-assisted, the prescribers, you rarely see outside of the office because that's where the money's being made in writing the scripts.
Yeah. I really appreciate our talking about kind of, I have this image of kind of concentric circles kind of nested in within one another, looking at various contexts. There's so much of my training and my work, and probably yours too, from a psychological perspective, has tended to look at the individual in terms of, for example, the contribution of trauma or the contribution of genetics to addiction, and then trying to find ways of resolving trauma, for example, addressing anxiety symptoms, depression, etc. And then if you just kind of radiate out more, then you begin to notice what's going on in the family, the larger family unit, and how relevant that is to the course of recovery from addiction. And then you expand into the community, and we're talking about Carroll County or the community that you live in and the work that you're doing. And then you move out into the state and then kind of the federal level. And all of these pertain. I'll tell you, Cheryl, somebody wrote a question earlier, and I want to answer it in an odd way. The question Nazim asks, what are the steps of successful recovery? And I'd like to suggest that you view the entire year's worth of podcasts as one thought. And I'm not saying that to be disregarding at all. It's an incredibly important question. And there's a lot of different ways of answering that question. What are the steps of successful recovery? But I'm wanting to answer it, and not mean to be evasive. I'm wanting to answer it in the vein of what Cheryl and I are talking about, is that it's almost like I'd rather talk about what are the domains that contribute to successful recovery for the sake of looking at this. And so one thing that Cheryl and I are talking about.
Yeah, how do you define successful?
Yeah. And so from a biological or biomedical perspective, what constitutes recovery? What are the goals? What are we looking for in terms of the return of brain functions and bodily functions? And how do we understand the biology of addiction? That's completely relevant to any conversation about any steps of successful recovery. Cheryl's and my backgrounds, respectively, are in clinical psychology and the work that we do as, in her case, therapist, my case as coach, and very much looking at the contribution of individual factors, psychological factors, emotional well-being, et cetera. That's a whole domain that relates to this, looking at stages of change and all of that from a psychological perspective. That's fully relevant. And then you can situate any person that's in seeking recovery from addiction in various communities, from their immediate family of origin or extended family to the community, as Cheryl's talking about, what kinds of resources are available, and then beginning to expand it into looking at what's available on a more molar level. And then I think I think that's completely valid, looking at kind of if you're looking biopsychosocial, but then I think there's a whole kind of social, political, economic perspective that we're talking about in terms of where are the priorities right now. This is Cheryl's going down to Concord, the capital, and lobbying for change, or looking at laws in terms of how telemedicine is handled differently from state to state, or licensing. These represent social political realities and economic realities that contribute greatly to our making progress. Cheryl, since the last time we talked, I introduced a friend. It might have been you. I don't think it was you, but it could have been you. A friend recommended to me the latest video that had gone somewhat viral by Johann Hari in an interview, a 3-hour interview with Joe Rogan. And it took me a few days to go get through the entire 3 hours. But I just mentioned that interview in a recent podcast where Johann Hari spent a good 2 or 3 years traveling to different nations in the world, including the U.S., looking at systemic issues that support or not, relatively on a continuum, successful recovery. So he, for example, he cited his work. He's Swiss he's English, but his father and his family originally are from Switzerland, so he looked at what Switzerland's doing in terms of addressing addiction and recovery. He looked at Portugal and went into great depth with what was going on in Portugal, mentions the Scandinavian countries, what's going on in the U.S. between states and nationally or federally. There's lots of innovations going on across the world that really bode well for the future of recovery, but we're dealing with this kind of painstakingly slow process of economic, social, political change that would make possible some things. Like you say, wouldn't it be a no-brainer with telemedicine? It's extremely convoluted politically, much less economically, with the influence of lobbying forces like the big pharma that you mentioned. Any thoughts about all of that, Cheryl?
I mean, so many thoughts. I mean, even the obstacles we go back to. I can't tell you how many people I've worked with through the years have lost their insurance because we don't have rural mail delivery. We have PO boxes.
Yeah.
So if you don't have a car, you can't get to the post office. And if you don't go to the post office once every couple of weeks, you miss deadlines. You lose your insurance.
Yeah. Yeah.
You can't afford treatment. I mean, so many. I also speak. When I first entered this field, I always say it found me. The work found me. I got a cold call from a headhunter asking me to run a group, and I've certainly worked with individuals suffering from addiction,
and
but I never directly did the treatment.
You've been friends with individuals with addiction.
I've been friends, but I've never, I certainly, went to grad school, but there was no one to do the work, and I felt, a responsibility to the community to give back. So I certainly can run groups. I certainly know the mental health piece, and I did my homework, and I took classes, and I learned more about the addiction piece. I've been doing this, like I said, 5 years. So much of my work isn't processing the psychological aspects. It's problem solving, access to resources. It's Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's food or shelter. Arranged transportation, huge. It's just, how can you get to the higher level work if someone's hungry or doesn't have stable housing? Or doesn't have clothing? It's just it's heart-wrenching. It really is heart-wrenching. And, again, many people have different philosophies about naloxone and medication-assisted treatment. I've seen it make people more functional, and I see it as a relativistic kind of concept rather than a black or white. Does it cure the addiction? Absolutely not. But does it save lives and make people more functional? Absolutely.
If you think about it, if you think about it in terms of Maslow's hierarchy, for our audience, some of you, we've discussed this in various forms. In fact, it's ironic. Next week's podcast is going to include some discussion of Maslow's hierarchy. You want to say a word about Abraham Maslow, Cheryl, and about his hierarchy?
You're pulling me back. So this is one of those Psych 101, first psych class concepts. And
good.
When did he live? He lived in the 20th century, and he developed a concept that you must meet the lower level needs before you can meet the higher levels. On the bottom, think of it as a triangle or a pyramid. On the bottom of the pyramid are your basic, food, water, shelter. Do you remember what's the second? I don't remember what level by level, but I know the top is more the existential needs, fulfillment of life, fulfillment, family, jobs, and so forth, and everything in between, relationships.
I think that's good enough, and we don't need to go into the details necessarily today, but just to put it in practical ways. If I'm not alive, then talking about my sobriety is kind of a non-starter. Just state the very flippant obvious. And so I fully agree with you. In fact, it came up today in a group. We were talking about, we were talking, it was very grave, the conversation. It was talking about suicide. I was at a local treatment center. And that in the context of looking at suicide, that other choices that are this side of dying actually may be preferable just because they sustain our physical life. They may not be our end goal. We were not talking about medication-assisted treatment, but it would be analogous to this. If you can get me to survive, I oftentimes will use this example, is that it doesn't really make much sense to talk about how things are going in my marriage if I don't have enough oxygen. It just doesn't make any sense. I have to breathe in order to have a relationship. So can we focus on oxygen supply to begin with? And I feel like a bit of that
Right,
with
right.
what we're talking about in terms of medical, in some ideal universe, we'd all be stabilized. We'd all have roofs over our heads and food, et cetera. We'd all have P.O. boxes that we could get to. But the fact is, if we don't, that's the first order of business. And that's Maslow in a nutshell, is that you have to address these basic needs before you get to these higher order needs. And I'm all for physical survival as a step towards whatever else it might be, which might include some form of sobriety.
It's funny. And I did some cases with you on these, behavioral problems in children, and I'd be called to the elementary school. And the first thing I'd say, did they have breakfast?
Yeah.
The second thing is, what time did they go to sleep last night? And if a kid is hungry and tired, they're not going to learn, how could they, they're not going to be able to, tend.
Yeah.
And so much of that transfers to the work that I'm doing now. And a lot of people can't get out of, their housing situations. And if they don't live in the most functional house, they can't afford. Again, I live in a tourist area, so the housing has skyrocketed. There's very limited workforce housing. That's a problem. There's a shortage of apartments. I don't know too many individuals who survive substance use disorders with great credit. That's a big issue. So to get mortgages and loans, many people don't have driver's licenses because they lost their licenses and can't afford the courses and the penalty and the insurance they need to get it back. So how can you get to work when your work is 10 or 15 miles away? I mean, it's layer upon layer upon layer. And it's, as Johann Hari says, it's about connection, and that, at the end of the day, I think is what, drives the work, is seeing the individual as more than, quote, the addict or, the disease. It's helping to get some level of function again.
Yeah, I remember in our last conversation, it brought tears to my eyes because I feel this so strongly with you, and you represent a goodly number of people in all of these fields, whether it's the medical field or the psychological, or people that are doing work in terms of making for political change, and you're involved in all of these worlds, is that you hold an awareness and appreciation, it feels like, for the whole person, and for, if we use Maslow, kind of all of these levels. And it's possible to bypass the obvious. And like you said, with that child who hasn't eaten or went to bed too late, they're not going to function well. And I really appreciate and respect this about you, Cheryl, is that you ask those basic questions. And I think those get missed. I think those can get missed in legislation. It's like the short-sightedness of some legislation that sounds good on paper. I don't know how this goes for you, Cheryl. I do find myself impatient with the kind of rhetoric that will be talking about the opioid epidemic, which it is, and how we need to do this and do that. And then when it comes down to the bottom line of, are we going to help people to get fed so they can get treatment or get to their post office box or whatever, there's a curious absence of interest sometimes, not always. I get very frustrated by that. I get very frustrated by legislative changes that make getting treatment more difficult than it already is. I work... my work in the week is... Go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
There's certainly a disconnect. New Hampshire just received a federal grant to address, obviously, the, quote, opiate epidemic. And I feel like it's a vacuous, jargony term, and they created what's called a hub and spoke model. I don't know if you have anything analogous to it. Vermont has done it as well. And what the premise behind it is to create hubs in every county, so nobody has to drive more than an hour to a hub. A hub is a place to go, quote, 24/7, where you can access care. Well, interestingly enough, there's no hub in Carroll County. The closest hub is a good hour away, and there's nothing that has changed with the spokes. There's no bolstering of services. The spokes of the services. So it's not like the feds are giving money to pour more services into the county. It's just that now there's a model, but unfortunately I'm seeing it's pretty vacuous, and it's thus far, I have not seen any known effect. Doesn't mean there isn't, perhaps in the southern part of the state or in other counties, or perhaps it's my own naivete or ignorance. I haven't seen it to be effective yet. It just rolled out, this winter, but I don't see any change in access to services.
Cheryl, speaking locally there, do you have a sense of where the fallout is? Where's the glitch in the works? Where's the hub and where's the spokes? Where's the beef?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, there's hub and there's no, and like,
Right.
What's interesting is Boulder Care, who I worked for,
Right.
would have been a wonderful spoke, right? So
Yes.
that would have been a great access treatment for all.
Yeah.
But our state couldn't support it. Or, it couldn't support our state either way, I mean, the end of the day, it's a private company, but at the same time, they had a wonderful mission and, we're serving a need, a market need. And unfortunately, viable right now in New Hampshire. Perhaps someday, I hope they come back. But, there's a lot of disappointment with them not doing what they were doing before.
Yeah. This is, one of the reasons I really wanted you to come back. Selfishly, I just want to have conversations with you, Cheryl. You already knew that. But I wanted to follow up because in the interim, since you were here just 2 months ago, this project, which you talked about in some detail, which seems so hopeful, has at least, for the time being, put on the shelf and maybe relatively permanently kind of off the map. And I just felt like it felt important to me to follow up with that, to look at the reality of some of the barriers that we're running into, whether it's on a micro level more locally in terms of getting staffing and like you were talking about in terms of coordination of services, on more of a macro level at the level of state and federal funding, where, again, there's a lot of political jargon or rhetoric flying around, but when it comes to the end of the day, is there really actually support for these services? And we have a lot of room at the top. There's a lot of room to grow, it seems like to me, and it's a very sad thing that what we talked about just 2 months ago has stalled and isn't going to happen in the foreseeable future. That's very sad to me.
It is very sad. I mean, in fairness to the company, they are continuing their commitment to. They were, doing some work with a local community health center, and they, maintain their commitment to that. And it's a pure business decision, and it's a startup company, and they have to follow where the money's at. And unfortunately, it's not New Hampshire.
Yeah.
And for that, I certainly understand. Yeah.
Where's any silver lining in all of this? I mean, any thoughts? I don't really want people to come away from today's presentation and just be horribly depressed. I think it's bracing what we're talking about, and I feel like it's realistic. But any thoughts about silver lining? I use that very lightly. But any thoughts about what good is happening and what may need to happen to promote further good?
I'm a big advocate of medication-assisted treatment. There's talk of, I'm blanking, there's an injectable form of naloxone that lasts 28 days. It's a really great alternative. The problem with it, I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, you have to be completely withdrawn from all opiates for 7 days, and that's a hard place to get to. But it takes Suboxone off the street, and some of the insurance companies, there's some movement in insurance companies reimbursing for that, and it also treats alcohol abuse as well. So that's a wonderful alternative. I feel like there's more public awareness, and that's so important. And I really also, there's a long way to go in terms of empathy and not having people, hold their judgmental values towards individuals struggling with addiction, but there's definitely more community awareness. Everybody knows someone who's been affected, and there's a big campaign right now.
Cheryl, let me interject something here. I'm looking back at this flyer for this event in Philadelphia, in your hometown, so to speak. The title of it is from Prescriptions to Heroin. The subtitle is, "It's a free event to reduce stigma and spread awareness of substance use in Philadelphia." And that kind of thing is really encouraging, isn't it? I mean, there's a massive outreach that's been going on for the last several months with these 3 pharmacy schools. They're very involved in innovative education at every level, from elementary schools and churches and temples and you name it. It's really going on. That feels very hopeful to me. And the key point why they're having me come is that I first of all know firsthand about stigma, but I've been studying it a lot, and I'm going to be speaking to that. It's just the fact that information, good information, has the potential of freeing us from ignorance and stigma, the stigma that attaches to ignorance, it seems like to me. And here, I'm just looking at this flyer right here. That's exactly what's going to be happening at this. That's the intentions of this conference. I'm really delighted to be a part of it. That feels like a move in the right direction. You're being involved at the state level as well as the local level in terms of lobbying and presenting information and so on. I can't see how that's anything but a really good thing.
It's a lot of work,
Yes,
and it's
yeah.
obviously a balance. It's a balancing act between, wanting to do, every day I get, several times a week, I'll get solicitations for individuals who are in need of therapy, and I can't do all pro bono work. I'm not in that position in my life where I'm able to, and it's always that balance between trying to make a living and trying to advocate for the causes that you believe in.
Yeah, yeah. I think you know
But there's
this.
definitely
I think you know this. I lead 12 groups a week now that are related to recovery, and my leading 12 groups a week enables me to lead 3 of those groups pro bono, and so it makes it possible. It's like you have to like work in order to put food on the table, a la Maslow, and it affords the possibility of being able to give away time, but you can't possibly do that and continue to take care of the lower level needs. And I know that you give away a tremendous amount of time. You talked about this when you go down to Concord. That's a whole day of work that you're giving up in terms of income to support you and the kids and so on. And we're doing what we can do, right, Cheryl?
We're doing what we can do, and like I said, I've been working with some individuals for 5 years now, and are they perfect? Many of them aren't, but are they doing better? Absolutely, and that's we all hope to be doing better. So we're on the right path.
Cheryl, I'm going to move towards winding down here. Let me mention one thing. We have some more comments coming in, and what I want to do is I want to respond. Nazim, this is you. I want to respond to you when I have more opportunity just to sit down and write you, and I will do that, okay? I want you to know that. You're asking some really important questions about healing of the nervous system and childhood negative effects, including trauma, and how those relate to addiction. And that's right in the center of the work that Cheryl and I do, and I'm very happy to respond to you. And I will do that after our podcast today. So thank you for your reaching out to us. Cheryl, is there anything that you want to, anything that we call it in the program burning desires. Do you have any burning desires, something you'd want to share before we wind down for today?
I think addiction, access to resources in rural areas and treatment in general looks a whole lot different in urban and suburban areas. And I think there are many obstacles in the rural areas that exist, and they absolutely have to be addressed, or else the individual can't access treatment.
Yeah. I'm just coming back from a visit with my daughter in Texas, and I'm aware that in the treatment centers where I consult, I have several clients currently that are from rural Texas. They had the means to come to California for treatment, which is not a given, as you well know. And they're out here in California, here in Southern California, where there's a concentration of treatment opportunities for them. They're here because there was literally nothing in their city or their county. These are people that live in rural areas like where you live and where I've grown up in most of my life, and they just happen to be fortunate that way. But I'm very aware that they're going back when they leave an intensive treatment milieu like here in Southern California. They're going back to areas like where you live with their just limited resources, and so half the battle is getting them into early treatment and just getting them kind of on the way to some form of sobriety and recovery. But the concern is about the generalization of the progress we've made when they go back to an area, a neck of the woods, where there isn't a Dr. Cheryl Bildner, where there isn't a psychiatrist, just like what the lack that you're talking about.
You you talk about residential treatment, that's not even a viable option.
Yeah.
It's not even on the table for so many clients that I work with. Like, they would never go to residential treatment. You know, they would never leave their families. They would never leave their children who would watch their children. They'd lose their job.
Yeah.
They couldn't get there.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it's
Yeah.
just like they wouldn't, you know, people talk about, you know, creating more residential facilities. And I'm not sure that's the direction, at least up here, that we need to go in.
Yeah. 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 Well, I hope that the conversation is an ongoing one, and maybe the next time that you come back, Cheryl, we'll have a little bit better news. I feel like I'm really glad to balance this out. I had a conversation yesterday with a psychiatrist, actually, and he was questioning me about positive psychology, in particular Martin Seligman, who comes from your alma mater at Penn. And we were talking about positive psychology, and I was sharing with him what I think positive psychology is and what I think it isn't. I think he had a very rudimentary understanding of positive psychology. But I think of what we're talking about here is a balanced approach, which looks at, there's a lot of good work going on. You're doing a tremendous amount of good work with a lot of obstacles where you live, Cheryl. I'm tempted to do the same thing here. I think it's really good for us to step back from the canvas, though, and talk about the larger kind of social political milieu that we're operating in, and that there's some limitations and there's a lot of room for progress. And I feel like that even, you know, I know that you're active politically, and I'm attempting to be more and more visible politically myself. I feel like that the more people that we can inform, these will be people that are informed voters, that can be themselves advocates for social change, and that we have a lot of room for progress here, for sure. Yeah, yeah. Really appreciate all that you're doing. Really love you dearly, Dr. C. Wish you blessings for all you're bringing. Thank you. Thank you for today. Thank you for coming. I do want to share with you that Nazim, who wrote in, I realized at the very end of what he shared, he says, "Thanks, I really love what you are doing." So I think that's to both of us. Thank you, Nazim. Thank you, Dr. C. Many blessings to you, Cheryl. You take good care.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Back to
All
you.
right.
You too.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Okay. All right. Bye-bye. We're going to be coming back next week, you all, to follow up on our previous conversation. We looked at forgiveness. This next week, we're going to be looking at the relationship of giving thanks and giving thanks specifically to reduce stress. Stress, from a psychological perspective, is the #1 trigger for relapse. Anything that we can do to reduce stress, which includes working on reconciliation and relationships, that touches on what we talked about in our last presentation on forgiveness, is a good thing. And the world expert on gratitude and its relationship to stress is here in the state of California at UC Davis, Robert Emmons. And we'll be citing Robert Emmons' research next week and doing some practical exercises to suggest other means for reducing stress in the form of gratitude practice. So come back and join us next Wednesday at our podcast. If you have any final questions for me or for Dr. C, you can send those to Ask an Addiction Specialist, and Austin and Odie will forward those to me. You can also write to me at my website, which is simply drbobweathers.com, and I'll get back to you from that. So please know that I'll be responding to you. For example, Nazim, the questions that you've turned in, I plan to get to those ASAP. I'll get back to you personally, okay? Thank you all for joining us. Come back next week, and thank you again, Dr. C from Dr. B here. Okay, take care, Cheryl. Bye-bye, everybody. Come back next week. We'll see you.